Hello and welcome to BloombergQuint. You're watching a special program with respect to certain draft guidelines that the Reserve Bank of India has released late Monday evening. The idea behind these draft guidelines is to essentially regulate the way banks and other financial services entities are able to sell their loan exposures. The loan exposures could be standard assets or could be NPAs. But for the purpose of this discussion, we are focusing this entire conversation on the sale of stressed assets and NPAs by banks as well as some of the other lenders in the market. To discuss this issue in detail, we are joined by Abizer Diwanji from EY, who will be taking us through some of the in charge of coming up with the recommendations on the basis of which the Reserve Bank of India has come out with these draft guidelines. Mr. Vanji, let me first start with the whole concept of selling stressed assets. Why was there a need to sort of revamp this entire system? I mean, clearly there were issues with the current system, but if you could take us through some of the core ideas that the committee went through before coming up with this new system.
So first of all, Vishwanath, let me tell you that this committee and the guidelines that have come out now pertain to a chance to try and create a secondary loan market for assets, not necessarily for stressed assets, but for stressed as well as good assets. Idea was that there needs to be one, price discovery for assets, two, a liquidity tool in the hands of banks to be able to sell the loans in a particular way. Third is to improve some kind of loan administration, because the idea was that when loans get traded, administration, which would then be centralized with one agency, actually gets to be much more efficient. So I think the idea of a secondary loan market was basically much beyond just trading in stressed assets. But coming to stressed assets, clearly there needs to be a market for stressed assets in India because price discovery is becoming an issue, especially where banks themselves, and especially our government sector banks, which are so governed with how do you establish a good market pricing. I think a secondary loan market would come handy. So that was the intent of the committee to actually set this up. And I think the rules follow that principle.
Right. To get a sense of where the market stands at this point in time, with respect to, there are multiple players who are of course participating in the entire transaction process, but the RBI heavily regulates the way banks can actually sell down their loans. In the current system, you can sell down the loan to maybe another bank or possibly to another ARC. Under these draft guidelines, that market is being opened up. There are other people who are being invited through a public auction process to come and participate in the entire process. Just want to get a sense of, what does this achieve? When you have other people who come into the market, apart from banks and ARCs alone, what does this tend to achieve?
So the idea was that the holders of assets, and if you look at the regulation, it kind of talks about it. The holder of assets actually was restricted to regulated entities, banks, and VFCs, etc., etc., IHFCs, etc. So, idea was that can we diversify credit to the holders outside of the banking system in a way to also deal with systemic risk in a better way. So, for example, we are allowing other non-bank institutions to come and participate. So foreign institutions can come and participate, mutual funds can come and participate, life insurance corporation and LIC, etc., can come and participate. Idea is to get things out of the banking system and get others to participate and make the market that much more robust with a lot more people coming and participating. That is the intent. So hopefully that's clear as to why. And by the way, financial institutions of holders of assets have these guidelines.
To understand this better, now
they've been allowed to sell assets while others have been allowed to buy assets. So there's a restriction on who can sell assets, but there is no restriction on who can buy assets.
Uh, just wanted to also get a sense from you with respect to where the guidelines stand. I mean, the first set of rules that the draft guidelines set aside is that the lender who is selling the loans needs to give up all legal rights to the buyer. Essentially, that it should be out of their reach, even in the event of a bankruptcy proceeding against the seller. Uh, I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense, where does this idea come from? Was there conflict in the past that led to this kind of specific guideline?
No, I think this is more clarity. What the intent of these guidelines seem to be, and I'm reading it as you're reading it, and so is everybody else. The intent of the guidelines seems to be that there has to be an achievement of a true sale. And by true sale, and if you read the guideline, it actually emphasizes on the fact of a true sale. Basically says that the seller of the asset, the transferor, has to completely steer clear of the asset. He should have no right or no obligation going forward. And if the obligation and the right for move from a transferor to a transferee, then clearly the bankruptcy related right also moves from a transferor to a transferee. So it's a complete detachment and a complete sale. The other thing it also says is you can't have too many bells and whistles around it. So you can't have contingencies with which the asset can fall back to you. If you want to exchange an asset, you can only do it in 120 days. In a portfolio, you cannot have credit enhancements provided. So when an asset is sold, the asset is sold along with the what the original originator had originated asset for. So the pricing then is a true pricing determined in the market for other people who are holding those loans. Similarly, you can't change too many terms and conditions. The terms and conditions that are there as part of a say consortium lending, and if you're selling your part of the exposure, unless everybody else agrees that those terms can be changed. So what it really says is, one, you achieve true sale, and you sell the asset at the market price of that asset given the existing terms and conditions. So I think the law tends to emphasize that, and that is the true way we will be able to evolve the market.
Right. As part of the entire, process, the price discovery aspect of this all, the laws seem to suggest, or the guidelines seem to suggest that a public auction would be a better way to ensure price discovery. Now we know that banks in general go for large scale bilateral deals whenever they're trying to sell down their loans. Uh, was that stopping a better price discovery in the market? Was that an issue that needed to be tackled through a public auction system?
No, so I don't think it mandates a public auction. It basically says that it's better to have a public auction or prefer public auctions for the simple reason that they want more and more transparency coming into the process. So here, I think the guidelines that the RBI and RBI tends to do it in most of the guidelines, it tends to leave it to the board to formulate a set of processes and procedures. And more often than not, it goes into a prescriptive mode in terms of trying to recommend those procedures and guidelines for the board to say one should follow. I don't think there is any specific intent behind this to say that, oh, bilateral deals ought not to be done at all, or sales have to be only through public auctions. But it just says that if you're trying to create a market, then try to have an auction process. Now, let me also tell you that earlier a seller used to put his assets on, and public auctions were called on, bids were called on for the assets. Here, it could be either way. Saying that ultimately what, and if you look at what the committee recommended, committee also said in its report, which is public, to say that there needs to be a sales trading platform. So once we reach a platform, frankly, that itself becomes an online auction trading mechanism. In which case, you may not even need public auctions. The shares, for example, on the stock exchange today don't need public auctions for every sale. So similarly, I think as the market expands, initially it is recommended that you do public auctions so that you create more transparency and more demand creation. But as and when more and more trades happen, frankly, it will become a marketplace in itself, which may not even require public auctions.
Trying to also get a sense of allowing the other bidders to participate in the entire process, and of course this public auction system having this sort of a first right of refusal available to the largest ARC that has an exposure to the account, or has already accumulated to the account. What is the idea behind having ARCs, or large financial institutions having this first right of refusal, when the idea is to find the highest bidder and the idea is to find the most valuable part of the asset?
So the first right of refusal was actually incorporated in the ARC guidelines because an ARC was to accumulate stressed assets from across lender bases, try and consolidate the exposure in its structure, and then work towards a resolution with a single resolution plan, so to say, or an MRA, Master Restructuring Agreement. That was the intent with which an ARC functioned, and that was the intent behind the regulation that came out for ARCs. I think that carries on for stressed assets at least, because ARCs can only purchase stressed assets. So for stressed assets, it actually says that ARCs should be allowed to accumulate a lot of these assets into them. And the preference given to them is to make sure that we still don't have dispersed shareholdings and we have somebody consolidate them. So that is the idea of getting ARCs. But again, now that we are on the topic of ARCs, I would also want to mention that specifically, the guidelines specifically do not include ARCs as sellers of assets, which I think they should include, because there is an ARC which would hold an asset, and they should be allowed to sell to another ARC or even to another institution if an institution is accumulating bad debts. So ARCs should be allowed to sell assets in the market as much as any other financial institution is. That will help the consolidation process.
Let me just also try and touch upon, since you mentioned that. I mean, at some parts of this entire guideline, the RBI says that it is trying to decentralize the guidelines, but also at the same breath, it's sort of putting up a lot of prescriptions as to how a sale should take place, what is the method of going by the public auction, who can participate, who cannot participate. Was there a need for the regulator to be this prescriptive when it comes to sale of loans, which of course banks and other lenders have been doing for many years now? It's not something that they've never done before.
No, so I am not of the view that lenders should be that, the regulator should be that prescriptive. And that's for the simple reason that, at least in India, I have seen this, where a regulator prescribes something that's taken as the Bible. And almost most financial institutions tend to follow it to the T, which is not, I think, the intent of the regulator either. So I think the regulator is trying to provide guidance to enable better governance in these structures. So I think if there was a one-liner which said that boards need to form their own policies, but these are the broad principles: a true sale, for example, correct discovery of pricing, of the asset, sale for cash, or any without any bells and whistles. If these kind of guiding principles were incorporated in a circular or a guideline, and then left to the respective governances of the respective financial institutions to form their guidelines, it would have been a better mechanism than to suggest auctions and whole processes. Because what happens is, as I repeat again, most financial institutions tend to just print those processes into their board guidelines, and then it becomes very difficult to implement them across the board.
Right. Okay. Let me also touch upon the point that some of the experts who I have spoken to seem to be raising, is that now we are very clearly moving away from the idea of this whole bankruptcy remote being in the hands of multiple lenders, as opposed to accumulating it under one entity and then probably just having that one entity deal with the entire bankruptcy needs. If there is a need for an insolvency proceeding against a company, then that one lender takes care of the entire process. Was this also part of the discussions at the committee, that the insolvency remote is probably at this point in time, because the level of the threshold for initiating insolvency is quite low, so anybody can at this point in time pretty much go to court and start an insolvency proceeding, which of course delays things for the company. Was that part of the discussion?
Well, so not really. I go back to the very preamble for which this committee is. Committee is set up for a loan trading platform, not necessarily to deal with how IBC was never mentioned in the whole thing, by the way. I think so. The intent of the committee was to formulate a policy or a regulation around setting up of a loan trading platform. I don't think that consolidations of exposures for an IBC is that important. This is quite outside the committee's recommendations. This is my personal view. I think what is important is that when resolutions happen, resolutions should be on a more consolidation thinking basis outside of IBC regulation. So I would rather that when an ARC mechanism, for example, under an ARC mechanism, if all the banks end up selling to one ARC, and that ARC then becomes a mandated largest institution to resolve a debt, I think resolutions will happen better and more efficient. IBC as a mechanism actually ensures a consensus of decisions anyway. So it, in a way, consolidates 66% of the holding because that much of a vote matters. So IBC does that job by itself. No regulation is required to enable that. So I don't think the intent was that, to answer your question.
Okay. One part of the guidelines also specifically, I mean, this was something that struck me quite surprisingly last night when the guidelines were released, was that the lender which is trying to sell the loan cannot have any kind of credit facilities in the future toward that borrower. Is there a need to create that sort of wall between the borrower and the lender once that loan has been sold? I fail to understand the logic behind that, sir.
So if an account is standard, for example, or if it's a normal role, I don't think that's a problem. In fact, I don't think it's a bit out of context to say that the person should not give lending to others. I haven't read it in the guidelines, but I'll check it clearly. In fact, if banks, if you look at the way banks ought to function, is they need to try and give project loans. Think of a scenario, they give project loans where there are no cash flows. And once the project starts delivering cash flows and the minimum holding period is met as defined in the Act, then the banks ought to churn those assets out to people who are supposed to be holding them outside of the banking system for annuities. For example, insurance companies, pension funds, etc. And the banks then would get their capital back to be redeployed in asset generation. And that's really the function of a bank. The bank actually lends towards asset generation. When the assets gets creating there, when the asset becomes cash flow generating, the assets ought to be churned out of the balance sheets. So ideally, if there is an infrastructure buildup, the bank should be coming back and funding them every time they build an asset, such that they can churn them out after the minimum holding period. So in my view, what you say actually goes against that very thesis. And the reason one of the reasons, as I said earlier, to have a loan trading platform was to enable banks to manage liquidity. So if the banks are able to successfully churn loans from good borrowers, they should be lending to them again. So I have missed this part in the guidelines, but I'll look into it for sure.
Right, sir. Okay, fair enough. The idea of having the secondary market for loan exposures that has been in discussions for a couple of years now. We have had some sort of stand-in procedures in place with respect to ARC sales and other auctions that are conducted by banks, at least when it comes to stressed asset sales. What with respect to bringing in the standard assets into the picture, how does that, I mean, you said that it obviously allows banks to redeploy their capital in a more efficient manner, but other than that, does this create also a bit of ambiguity in terms of the borrower's mind, because the loan then just keeps going down and down to different lenders? There is a 12-month period for which the holding period needs to be met with, but other than that, the lenders keep changing.
Yeah, I mean, and how does it matter as long as somebody is servicing the loan better? Look at the advantages, Vishwanath. One is that if the loan moves away from the originator into an investor, so to say, once the cash flow starts generating, then that investor is a holder of the loan. And in all probability, the originator or a professional loan monitoring agency will come in to monitor the loans. So what's more important for the borrower is that he should not be re-providing all the information from scratch onto a new investor. That would be painful for him. So ideally, there needs to be an ecosystem where there is a repository of the loan documents. There is a repository of regular MIS on covenant monitoring, financial statements, inventory management, etc., flowing into a loan administrator, which could well be an originator. And that process has to become so efficient that anybody can get an updated due diligence on the account, and he does not have to suffer or go back to a borrower for information every time. If the borrower has to keep providing due diligence every time an investor or a borrower changes, if a lender, has to provide more due diligence every time a borrower changes, that's going to be painful for him. But I don't think that's the intent. The intent is to make sure that it moves from a class of borrower, which is the banks, which fund asset creation, onto a set of investor, which is an asset financier, but who needs regular cash flow. So once an asset is completed, it should move to a financier's balance sheet. And the banks then churn themselves. I think that will also make it more capital efficient. And especially for a government sector banks, it will require lesser capital from the government coffers.
Right, sir. Last question from my end. If you can give us a picture of what stress asset sales are going to look like, say 2 years, 5 years down the line, with respect to with banks and ARCs and multiple other entities who might be wanting to trade in these loans. Whether these guidelines are going to ensure that that platform that it seeks to create is going to be a more efficient way of dealing with the stress asset scenario.
Yeah, so on the stress assets specifically, I think India will need much more asset accumulators, whether it's in the form of ERCs or any other distress funds or anything else. But they need to have asset accumulators where an average of 25 banks or 20 banks converges into top 10 ARCs or asset holders. So the decision making has to move. The ARC can do a leveraged SR structure. The ARC can do cash, whatever else it wants, but the ARC or a fund will then have to own a substantial part of the debt to be able to start a restructuring process. It's like anybody doing controlled transaction versus a dispersed transaction. If five private equity owns 5% each in a company, they collectively, unless they get together, they collectively can't do anything. But if they hold more than 26% of the company, then they can influence the board. So it's similar in this situation, where I think if we have good asset accumulation, which I think the lack of IBC for the next 6 months and the lack of efficient investors to come in will enable a lot of asset accumulation in ARCs, in my opinion, provided they have capital. And once that asset accumulation happens, the ARCs will have to work towards taking control or working with existing promoters through a June 7th circular and start resolution. I'm coming to your point on trading. Once the resolution starts, the respective SRs or the paper on that stressed asset, which actually start getting traded in the market. And there's something that will happen, I think, over the next 2 to 3 years, which is called yield compression, in my view. And yield compression really means is that today I may price an asset at a 20% IRR because of the riskiness or the stressedness in the asset. But if I am able to reduce stress through an effective turnaround of that asset over the next 2 to 3 years, that asset will start trading at 12% or 10%, which is when I will have investors coming in the form of distressed funds or regular funds, debt funds, credit funds who are trading investments. If they go down to, and if the asset improves and the yields go down to 8, 7, or 8%, I may be able to place the same paper with the likes of insurance companies that refinance the banks up. So I think a yield compression play when the asset quality improves, but that will only improve after there is consolidation. It may not improve if the borrowing structure is consolidated, is dispersed as it is today. So once it gets consolidated, I think there is a way for a subprime or moving up to prime market on the debt side.
Right, Mr. Diwanji, thank you so much for joining us on this conversation and taking us through some of the more core highlights of the entire set of draft guidelines. Of course, we still need to see what the final guidelines are going to look like, if there's going to be any material change in the way the RBI is approaching this entire process. But thank you so much for coming in and giving us that expert opinion on this matter. And thank you so much for watching this on BloombergQuint.